Welcome to Planet Poetry. My name is Peter Kenny.
And I'm Robin Houghton. And in this episode, we're talking with Martin Malone about his selected poems 2005 to 2020, which is called Lark Song Static, and also his new collaboration with artist Brian Angus called Gardenstown.
And then we chat about Dylan Thomas sitting under a full moon thinking of lovers and ask, what is the point of pamphlets? Controversial.
So before that, let's hear what Martin Malone had to say to Peter.
Martin Malone has published 4 poetry collections: The Waiting Hillside, Templar, 2011, Kerr, Shoestring, 2015, The Unreturning, Shoestring, 2019, Gardenstown, Broken Sleep Books, 2024, and A Selected Poems, 2005 to 2020, Lark Song Static, from Hedgehog in 2020. He's also published 4 pamphlets, 17 Landscapes, Prodigals, Mr. Willett's Summertime, and Shetland Lyrics. He is an editor at Poetry Salzburg Review and a poetry ambassador for the Scottish Poetry Library. Martin Malone, welcome to Planet Poetry. So, where are you?
Well, on the Planet Poetry right now, I'm in Donegal, in a town called Carndona, just up from an old Celtic cross. And I've got a peat brick on the fire as well, so how much more Irish can you get?
What does it smell like?
Oh, it's an Irish joss stick, isn't it, Pete? It's always the one thing that makes me feel at home. Actually, you can smell it in the air, in the streets, or in the summer when it's drying.
Yeah.
You can actually smell it. It's always one of my favourite smells.
Today we're going to talk about 2 of your recent publications, beautifully named Lark Song Static, your selected poems from 2005 to 2020, and the more recently released Gardenstown, which is a collaboration between you and the artist Brian Angus, and it's an astonishingly beautiful book from Broken Sleep Books. So we'll talk about that too. I was thinking about, how do people know you? Because you've got lots of strands. Apart from people that love your books, that you're also really well known for having edited The Interpreter's House. Also, there's that music career that keeps plaguing you and you return to.
Good choice of words, Peter. Yeah, plaguing.
Maybe we'll get you reading a poem. It's an obvious link, but there's a poem from Lark Song Static called The Interpreter's House.
That was a shoe-in, wasn't it, that one?
It's almost like I planned it.
The Interpreter's House. With bread at 6pence a quartern, it is better to work in the country than starve in a city. So the interpreter packs for the coast, 16 boxes from Lambeth to Sussex, copperplate, burins, furniture and ink, handmade clothes, his wooden press. Not much to show for the company of angels, no flash portmanteau on the road to Zion. But here the wind sweeps through the cornfield with the clamour of souls, gales sigh in the thatch, and the shifting light of his first viewed sea forms the shape of a man, particle bright with eternity. Here there is purple time, clematis above the gate, and an elm overlooking the downs. Here birdsong and odours of the happy ground. September, and it starts well enough. The bread of sweet thought and the wine of delight feeds the village of Feltham by day and by night. He learns Latin and Greek, takes on Hebrew that he may speak to God in his own tongue, notes how meat is cheaper than in London. Lust descends daily, and from him the sea trolls visions of Albion, shoals cherubim in quicksilver glints of how it might be. Then winter's damp climbs through cellarless floors, fever and toil, the poor man's aqua fortis, corrode his golden net, and hell is Haley's commission. Jerusalem so begins, but remains unbuilt. The sword stays awake in yellowing hands, and a downland cottage comes up to let in England's green and pleasant land.
I'm taking that as a sort of glimpse into Blake's life.
Yes.
It's kind of layered as well, because the Interpreter's House comes from Pilgrim's Progress, doesn't it?
It was, yeah, it does come from Pilgrim's Progress, but I think Blake, his friends called him the Interpreter as well.
Oh,
The poem itself originally was a piece commissioned for a 2015 book, which I have here. I think I'll flash it to you,
yeah.
called The Echoing Green,
Oh,
edited by Richard Skinner. And it
nice.
was part of something called the Big Blake Project to raise awareness and funds to buy Blake's cottage
Yeah.
in Feltham and the South Downs and have it as a monument to the nation. But I wanted to write one bespoke for the book, given its subject.
Yeah.
And I was editing the Interpreter's House at the time, so it all fell nicely into place.
There is a lot of walking and travelling and the natural world in your poetry. And also there's a real theme of engaging with visual artists as well. We're almost talking about Blake the artist rather than the poet.
Oh, we are.
You're clearly stimulated and engaged with the arts and also music and also being a poet. What was the sequence of all that unfolding in your life?
Well, it's always been along for the ride, the arts and music. And probably it functions as a kind of oblique meditation of sorts on my own practice.
Yeah.
I find it quite useful. It casts an interesting light on the central thing you do. And I've always found, actually, probably slightly greater kinship with artists, visual artists, and certainly musicians. Sorry, Poetry Planet. Initially, it was very practical. I'd had my first book out, and the visual arts were kind of a discovered means, I suppose, by which I tried to move myself on. And then secondly, in its time, it became a sort of creative love letter to my son's mother. She's an art historian and curator.
Yeah.
And someone wise, shrewdly observed that that's when I started writing a lot of ekphrastic stuff, that's what it was. In order to address what I write about, which I suppose you could describe as traditional poetic topics like love, landscape, war, etc. And it just, there were a means by which to import another semantic field and maybe cast some new light on it.
Oh, that's interesting. A lot of people know you primarily for your sort of war poetry, but there's a kind of a thread of real bittersweet love poems as well. I find the stance you take very distinctive. There's a poem I particularly like called On an Afternoon Like This, She Takes a New Lover, which is a fab title. That's almost a poem in itself, isn't it?
It's an odd one to talk about now, as it seems like a moment that was several lifetimes ago, actually. On an afternoon like this, she takes a new lover. This afternoon, you meet your new lover. I'm in the outfield waiting on catches while you smile and give back his gaze. I bend to dry my palms in the June dust as you raise your glass beside a canal. I cross to the other side of the square. You note that he is left-handed like me. As you sidestep the man-trap of memory, I revive an old Scott Walker song. A wagtail threads its flight path left to right in the second his hand lingers on your leg. And as you watch him walk into the pub, you make your decision while measuring his length for the cabin bed. In my head, you are nowhere as the ball arcs skyward and swirls my way. Steadying ourselves, we prepare for the afternoon's moment. This says, I will drop it. This says, he will fit.
There's quite a lot of sort of traditional English imagery that permeates your work. This beautiful June day and being in the outfield, but is it actually an outfield, or are you peering at this woman and seeing what's going on? And the dreadful fatalism about this. But I love how at the end the ball's coming towards you, but you don't tell us what happens. I suspect it's dropped.
I was very much in all kinds of outfield at that moment. It was some attempt to own a painful moment and to not look away or elide a worst fear, but to look at it unflinchingly and be as spiritually generous and unafraid as I could be at that point. I suppose it was also an attempt to measure myself as a human and to try and walk the talk of a relationship that was being lost almost in the real time of that poem itself.
Yeah.
It came out of one of those moments of instinctive, imaginative insights that was actually spot on.
How long do those moments take to filter through you into poems?
I think there's a lot of instantaneous response out there in poetry at the minute. I don't think it serves the poetry best. You run the risk of it not lingering long enough on the palate. So sometimes with the really big moments, I think it's sometimes best to let it filter and percolate. I ran away from the music industry to into the arms of something I thought was a bit more considered and grown up.
Yeah.
And actually, there's a lot of times now I'm thinking poetry's worse. I don't know why that is. I don't know why that is.
You did a PhD in Great War poetry, didn't you?
Mm.
In your response to it, in your poems, it feels really personal, almost like you are, living it and breathing it yourself. I just wonder, what need was it fulfilling for you?
I think if you live with something for 3 years, you do engage personally with it. But actually, the Great War was not a big preoccupation of mine until one of my oldest friends, a school friend, Dr. Elizabeth Pender over at Leeds, contacted me. I was living in Avebury at the time, playing cricket for that team you heard about earlier, and she said, "Look, I put together a funding bid, and I've never worked with you. I want you to apply for this PhD." I thought, "Oh, what the hell?" I put in an application on the morning of the deadline. I threw a sickie and threw it. But my premise was, I'll do it on these terms only, and that is that I can split it down the middle and do an academic half, which I'm comfortable with, but also write a book of poetry. Because I thought, if I got the grant, it's effectively like getting a record deal for 3 years. I'll never be in a position again whereby someone is paying me to live to write a book of poetry. I mean, I desperately wanted to honour the memory and innocence and selflessness of those young men and women, not militarily, but as humans. The grant came about because it was the centenary of the Great War, and a particular colour of government was in who've tended to use that conflict as something of a recruiting tool for its bogus notions of nationalism and patriotism. We've seen the spinning out of that afterwards. But I wanted to push back at that politicised revisionism and reclaim, if you like, the more enlightened, to me anyway, 1960s view of World War One as a senseless bloodbath.
Yeah.
So in the book itself, to address the poetry, I was always going after what I called the Great War's active ingredient, which is its ability to teach us contemporary lessons about the world. The deeper I dug, the more apparent were the parallels with our own times. And so that actually became my MO as the book progressed. I was looking for that active ingredient, and it merely being awake and picking up the newspapers or looking at the news feeds. And just as I researched the history of it and the day-to-day events of 1914 to 18, literally 100 years later, I could pick up equivalents of it. The Great War was the dragon that lay across the threshold of the modern world, really. On an intra-poetic level, it was fascinating for me because there were 2,330 First World War poets that were published. The legacy of the key poet that have drifted through, we still feel today. I mean, knowing a bit of Wilfred Owen's almost an act of British citizenship, isn't it? Now. Plus the fact that around me in the world, there seem to be a lot of politically and creatively meek responses to the centenary. I didn't see much that was trying to say anything new. There was a lot of curating of World War One, rather than going out to try and find, as I say, that active ingredient of it.
Maybe we should hear one of those poems. I like the poem Rippenwerk, seeing as we were talking about Wilfred Owen.
I'm going to go on record as saying that Rosenberg was infinitely better.
Oh.
He is my World War One poet, but I mean, better, what is that in poetry? All that sense of competition drives me mad. Wilfred Owen was extraordinary too. When I was 18, 19, I went on a little holiday to Ripon. And then when I did more research on it for my PhD, I was fascinated by how significant that little episode was. So hence this poem. Rippenwerk. They are dying again at Beaumont Hamel as you stroll Borridge Lane, 3 days after your 25th birthday, mind yet cobbled with skulls of the lads you left behind. Spring is pushing back through the hedgerow with lesser celandines, and along the banks of the Skell, a kingfisher's lyddite triggers that ghost of a twitch. At number 7 you unlatch the gate, take out a key and stroll up to the white front door. Searching for peace, you retreat to the attic with its tiny skylight, the shrieks of children playing soldiers down on the street. Here you are Chatterton and Keats, half in love with death's idea while making best use of its dutiful shadow. You write your mother, go over old drafts, defectuosities, and the inwardness of war. Briefly, you pause to listen to swallows skirruping in their early return. Then, back to your notes, strike-throughs, seance and retrospection. Another time-strafed Edwardian caught out in the open with defective kit. The town's darkening lanes are kind to you, gift you a send-off. And here, sensing how it all will end, you teach yourself to carry your cross.
There's a different kind of interiority we're getting here about Wilfred Owen, and the sort of detail of the swallows, their early return, and his early return to kind of regroup before going out to lose his life just before the end of the war.
There's a point in there where it actually becomes a bit of crack crit. I mean, the whole idea that the Edwardian poets, with their kit of Edwardian poetry tools, were suddenly confronted with something way beyond their previous knowledge.
Yeah.
And there's a sense in which the English poets had certainly struggled to come to terms with the monstrosities of mechanized warfare on the Western Front and beyond.
Yeah.
I actually think that the German and French poets were better kitted out to confront it than the English ones. But isn't it strange that the English ones, with our yearning towards the countryside and Arden.
I'm going to force you to change gear now. We're zooming off to Manhattan.
Okay.
We're in a hotel bar.
Back to music again here, because this is one of the few poems I know of that has an album named after it. I did a solo album around the turn of the millennium called The Training for Loneliness.
Yeah, it's such a brilliant title.
The next one was going to be called The Sex of Tender Despair. So that probably touches on... it never got made in the end. I walked out on music for 20 years at that point. The Training for Loneliness. Until it was you, my son, your father's best work was that night in Manhattan, alone in a midtown hotel but for the barman from Roscommon, explaining to me the finer points of hurling, while I waited for the hour to come and go when we'd meet for that drink, look one another in the eye, and head our separate ways. No sane woman would cross the pond to drink to an also-ran, so I knew she wouldn't show. But the point was that I had, and there began my draft of you. As the moment passed, I swear that's life lit up the jukebox right on cue, as if it knew a fool's errand was over. Fionn asked why I was laughing as I drained my glass of Powers. When I told him, he poured me another and we got to talking, as fellas sometimes do, about loneliness and home, and the great American songbook of lost love that crops up at a time like this. Your father, as a younger man, trying to write the poem that will become you and is you and will go on when this song is well sung.
First of all, just the absolute mood of that poem is so kind of evocative. The loneliness of talking to a barman, waiting for somebody who's not going to show. Is this a poem about your father as a younger man trying to write the poem that will become you, which is just a lovely, lovely thought. There's a sense of hope out of it as well, out of that kind of desolate moment.
Yeah.
That actually becomes really quite optimistic. A poem of immense space.
I suppose it's a very Edward Hopper painting, isn't it? So there's the art thing we've discussed. It's that looking in the window at the guy sat at a bar in Manhattan. It is about fatherhood, but I'm the father there. This is a kind of address to my son, Fionn. Absolutely true story. It's another relationship poem, another end of relationship poem, but this is one more greatly informed by being latterly seen as that thing about time and distance through the prism of my own fatherhood. I did actually once at the end of a relationship, we'd gone to New York 18 months earlier and we'd said, I'll tell you what, if it doesn't happen, if we end up coming apart, be here on this date at this time in this bar, we'll have a drink together and we'll make it right, whether it happens or not. And we did duly split up. And I went. I threw another sickie. God, I'm a terrible employee. And I threw another sickie, flew to New York to be there at the date and the time. It's quite cinematic. You can see I'm an old romantic, aren't I?
You are. Absolutely.
I was in Bogart mode that night. I went there and I sat in that bar in Manhattan and knew she wouldn't come. All my friends were very concerned that I would break my heart, but I knew she wouldn't come. I had to. For me, I had to go.
Now we're going to move on to Gardenstown, your latest book from Broken Sleep Books. Tell me how this came about. It's obviously the result of a stay in Gardenstown, which is on the east coast of Scotland.
Yeah, well, I lived there. I didn't want to leave the town where my son was, so I actually bought a house just 10 yards up at Bray. It came about originally because Brian Angus, who we haven't mentioned yet, he's a printmaker. He said, I've got an exhibition in Edinburgh. Do you want to write something for the catalogue? Because his images work in a similar area to my landscape stuff, which again returns us to Blake, I suppose, who was also a printmaker. So I wrote a short poem, and then one night couldn't sleep and went for a walk down to the end of the pier and just looked back at the town and realised what an amazing place. Pinch me, I live here. It was just an amazing, astonishing place. So I started writing a poem about that moment, and I realised that elements of the poem I'd written for Brian's catalogue would fit in. So the introduction, the Nocturne Abad, Nocturne is me not being able to sleep, and then the morning after. And it worked, and it was a long poem, and I thought, oh, I'm not finished with this. And then along came lockdown. It facilitated a prolonged act of looking. And just the natural symphonic structure of the four seasons suggested itself to me. I was there in them.
It does feel like a labour of love. There's lots of strands in there as well. The pandemic is lurking in the background, but there's a sort of the ecological concerns, but not overplayed.
I didn't want to overplay it. I don't think sloganising and directness is poetry's forte sometimes.
No.
And also, to link back to the war poetry, Edward Thomas is kind of a war poet, but he's a very oblique war poet. He didn't spend long at the front, so most of his poetry is looking at the little details. I was saying about, in the introduction, I talk about the climate crisis.
I'd like you to read two sections of this poem. We're recording this as autumn is upon us, so I'd like you to read the section on autumn.
Autumn. Already cumulus piles high against the morning, as, beaked tug full of carrion, the season starts with crows and 6 dead guillemots garnishing the tide line. Daybreak runs beside me over sand and fetid kelp, stares back across the bay to Crivy Head, where a low ha traps, then turns to ghost the light. Greys edge out the far north's sunken tones, and attention is required to see a second spring dormant in these finer days of late September. This is no immense thing, but a subtle one which speaks of love and the way we're caught in our moment as vividly as mammoth calves in ice, while the honeysuckle outstares God from the braes of Castle Hill. In the town, its streets grow quiet now. The rentals peter out to rain. Quiz night's back in the Arms Hotel. Steve takes stock in the wee shoppy, and Jane moves up into Westerhall with her whippet and homemade coffin like some Egyptian queen. Dawn fruits a fat white moon hung low above St. John's as the bay blooms its trawlers about their business of squid and the year's last flourishings of mackerel. Tea time's a spindrift of baltering bairns home from Brackenden, while sunset is kestrel feathered, hovering its greys and marigold out above the banks of Low Hill. The tide moves quickly, sweeping detail in and out of itself, while waders follow its flow, redshank, turnstone, oystercatcher and knot, the odd lawn curlew gathering about itself absence and some vague glim of eviction. Throughout the night, pink-footed geese hit landfall in ragged skeins from Iceland, bound for Strathbeg. their song a stramash of wild telling renewing the host's adherence, while we too replenish and reset for the cold days ahead, hushed in the year's twilight. October ends in a swag of blue netting and boats craned from the harbour to sit out the squalls of a Filsket sea. On days like these, when the light lies so low to the ground it lacks direction, objects allied one into the other, and the more is a state of mind that will not be explained. Autumn tides rake the braid sands, lengthening those thin shadows cast by the storm-spurred apostles. Set down tree trunks, hanks of tangle, and the lone rubber glove put ashore beside the innards, feather and bone of a decommissioned gull. This is the season of aurora shifting in the high latitudes, of Ursa Major snouting the dark above the bay while we set fires to burn long into the night. And through it all, saved gamery settles down to pray, Bible in hand. Its best suits Sunday sat in kirk or chapel, witnessing the word and waiting upon eschaton to the doleful note of an electronic organ in the Gospel Hall or Free Protestant Church of Ulster. All is here, though not all called to the edge of the world in these, the last of the last days.
I just so enjoy that poem.
Thank you.
The language is so rich. It also kind of follows in this tradition of that elegiac tone we have, when addressing autumn. I wanted to ask you about this line, the squalls of a Filsket sea.
It's a Shetlandic word, that Filsket.
Yeah.
Kind of a rough sea when the sea's getting a bit skittish.
Yeah.
I did want to lace it with some local words, and I've been going to Shetland a lot, and a Shetlandic word like Filsket was just perfect for the sea once the autumn tides start.
I like that idea of just going around pocketing pebbles of other people's dialects. Yeah.
Hopefully paying it respect and giving it a little bit of airtime in the process.
I get the idea you were sort of walking around on the coast. You've absorbed so many details of the nature, and it's almost a bit kind of Yeatsian in hiding your face amid a crowd of stars at the end.
Well, it was that.
Yeah.
It was just walking around with my eyes open, and I'll never stop celebrating the fact that I've lived there.
Brian Angus's prints are absolutely extraordinary, aren't they?
He's a fine artist.
Yeah.
It was funny when I contacted him. I said, I've just moved here and I'm a poet. And I got I could hear the tone from the email. Oh, you're a poet, are you? And he really is a local. I mean, he grew up in that area. And we're working on another book together of bird imagery.
Well, I'd like another reading from the book, which is the last section, March, April 2020, which of course we all remember as an ominous time.
I wanted to make the cycle work, so it ended with this poem for reasons which will become obvious at the end, I guess.
Yeah.
March, April 2020. So it finds you on a cliff top at 6 a.m., falcon-eyed above the scarped town, its slow tectonic seen from a bench beside St. John's, its human strata visible there below the bungalow bluff of new-build natives, in the empty second home of Seatown's log-damp yearning. The tide rolls in and out and into the bay. New daffodils gild the path to the old graves. A phasey croaks its hollow from the cover of the gorse, and roe deer freeze on the brink of Muckle Wife. Light comes slowly, chases the loose change of houses set tight in the pocket of red cliffs as you haunt the old kirkyard's mouthful of smashed molars, taking their text for your own. From the road, a crow raises its curse on some car-caned fox or badger, while you descend from Westerhall to spend an hour flush to the sea's sullen teal in the roaring maw of the bay beneath Moor Head, the tide unloading its white noise into the ear's quarter crown. 2 hours back, you crept across the sand to wait in darkness on the rumour of otter and mink, alive in the dingle of Pishlin Burn or Den of Findon. Nothing came but the dawn. Nothing moved but the shore's slow reveal of kelp and the raptor's dark covenant with the bray. Nothing brought nothing but Crivy's cute one-liner, the Skerry-light's cry for help, and the crescent gather of wave of pecking Craig, all give and give, then taken back again. No Eastering here, but a coastline of wave cut and stone chat. No inscape but a buckled mind's frailty for the April lyrid's random scatter of meaning on the heaven-empty primrose. Despite us all, spring comes to the bay's proscenium in a spike of wild orchids at the foot of Castle Hill, with sea campion and vetch, with violet and stitchwort, ragged robin and celandine, in the flitting of wren and pipit, eruptions of gannet on water, and the musical comedy of eides. The tide slackens and stills to the morning's mood, its lines flatten, its breathing short. You walk out to the point below the head, inhale deeply the coconut flowering of gorse that has swept its wildfire down the hillside. The paths are perfect level, narrow gauging itself across well-trodden scree as far out as Snow Craig, to the rising cairn of stones built ghost upon ghost by drifters, their hand-painted sign reading, "This is the end."
I love the ominousness of that. There's just something lovely about the names of plants, like, violet and stitchwort, sea campion, vetch.
Because we were all allowed to stay still. Flowers are not my strong point.
Yeah.
That was Fion's mum, Jen. We used the time. She taught me about the flowers a little bit while we were sitting still. Remarkably beautiful spring.
It was. Maybe it's that your use of the word inscape, but there's a kind of Hopkins feel about this somehow, and an Edward Thomasiness. Is Hopkins somebody that lurks under the surface in your influences?
Yeah, well, Hopkins is one of two poets I can think of, Dylan Thomas being the other.
Yeah.
That you have to be very careful with handling, because they're so distinctive, they're so themselves, that they'll linger on the breath like strong liquor if you're not careful. So it's almost impossible to write in their vein.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, something about their sensibilities and the location, from the minute I got there, went, well, this is just Laregib.
Yeah.
The worst thing I wanted to be seen as the Scottish Under Milkwood, because it's a very different poem, but there's something of it there.
Yeah.
And with Hopkins, there's something about just the sheer joy of just standing still and being able to appreciate and celebrating nature in all its infinite details.
Yeah. Well, I want to find out what you've got on the pipeline. You've more poetry forthcoming from Mariscat. You've also got Innocence Abroad, Late Spring. Is that the title of your next musical collection?
It is, yeah. It's in keeping with the poem, isn't it, really? And Brian's done the cover, funnily enough.
Oh, has he? Oh, brilliant.
Late Spring we recorded in Berlin this year.
Yeah.
Next March, hopefully in time for Stanza, Mariscat are doing a pamphlet of sonnets of mine called Sonnets for My Mother as Leah. My mum's in the grip of the care system at the moment, so it's actually as much about the care system as it now is.
Yeah.
So that'll be coming out hopefully in the spring. But my main squeeze is more landscape stuff, I guess. I've got a book called Little Nowhere, which is the name of my house in Gardenstown. And the care system being what it is just suggested that it wasn't quite finished at 20 sonnets. I'm blowing that one up into another collection. That makes 3 on the go, called Not What But Who. Yeah. And that'll be 50 sonnets. Oh. Very lucky man, living my best life. Just wish I had another 20-year rebate on it. That's all.
Yeah,
so I could have another 20 more.
Well, Martin, thank you for bringing the freshness of those places by the sea. Thank you very much, and it's been delightful talking to you.
Peter, I'm absolutely delighted to have spoken. I really do like Planet Poetry. To be on it is a real privilege. Thank you.
Martin Malone, he's had a life, hasn't he? I'm making him sound like an ancient now. He's probably the same age as us. But I mean, he's moved all over the place and he's done so many things. It was fascinating to see how he's threaded these various aspects of his life into his work. I really enjoyed that.
I felt that he was almost like one of those old-fashioned bards travelling around the country and you know, writing about all kinds of things and making music and being in bands. And he's one of these people that really is a poet. I almost feel I have to sort of apologise, really, because, you know, I've been dwelling with his poems afterwards, and I don't feel like I really interrogated him enough about them, you know, because I was so swept along by the flow of his banter that I didn't really want to interrupt him. But the poems themselves are extremely accomplished.
I know what you mean. I mean, he spoke a lot, didn't he, about the provenance of things and what had inspired him, and that's all fascinating. But yes, the poems themselves are dense and, as you say, very accomplished, and he works with form very well. And there was that poem that you talked about, the fact that he'd used some, not exactly dialect words, but I think, he used
Shetlandic word. Yeah.
Shetlandic word. Was that Autumn? Was that from Gardenstown?
Yes, it was, yeah.
Yes, and as he was reading that, and I was thinking the details of the characters at the beginning, there's the woman who's making her way up the hill with a homemade coffin and a whippet or something, but they've all got names, and I was thinking Under Milkwood, I'm sorry. So when he started saying later on, he doesn't want to be compared to Dylan Thomas, and it's not Under Milkwood, but it definitely had that kind of resonance for me, particularly at the start of that poem, and I really, really enjoyed it. It's such a lot of detail about a townscape and town folk and the depths of culture and history, and layered beneath the ground like seams of coal, or like peat. I mean, peat takes centuries to grow, doesn't it? So it all felt very apt.
Well, yeah, I liked, you know, talking to him and hearing his peat fire on the recording. There was a crack or something.
Is that what the crackling was? Oh, and we've got a memory of fire and Martin Malone, haven't we? Didn't that time he came and read at Telltale and Friends down in Lewis?
Yes, that's right. His clipboard, I don't know how you achieved this, but his clipboard caught on fire. I think he was reading some of his First World War poems. And
he was on fire.
Flaming. It's the rock and roll in him. He can't help it.
He can't help it. These dramas, they follow him. But I don't remember anybody worrying about this fire, that nobody rushed for the fire extinguisher and think it was all very laid back, wasn't it?
We thought it was all part of the performance.
But you're right. The poems do bear a lot of scrutiny, and I know that the Gardenstown I really enjoyed particularly, and that's the sequence, the pandemic sequence. You know, the sort of coming of the early days of the pandemic.
In that autumn section of Gardenstown, you know, 6 dead guillemots garnishing the tide line. You know, those kind of details where you think, what on earth is going on there? Why are all these dead guillemots just washing up on the sea? There's something really ominous, but he doesn't over-egg it. You know, it's just part of the landscape as he's finding it. He was making me think of Edward Thomas, and lots of Edward Thomas's, you know, somebody setting off for a massive walk and encountering, you know, all kinds of strange things, from, you know, doubles or war poems, like Martin was saying, you know, really focused on the minutiae, like hearing, you know, rain on a hut roof while you're being trained and things like that. But the Englishness of it all, you know, like the poem, on an afternoon like this, she takes a new lover. He's there in the outfield of a cricket team.
That was lovely. I really liked that.
What could be, you know, more English than that? And yet, while that's all happening, and, you know, a ball is lofted his way and he's going to catch it, the whole of his life is changing there, you know, in that moment, in real time.
Yeah. No, I really enjoyed that, and that sort of, it's just such a clever to have those two viewpoints of him imagining the ex-girlfriend and it all happening at the same time. Very cleverly put together, and he called it, didn't he? He said it was an attempt to own a painful moment, and I thought that was that summed it up very well.
Yeah, and he did tell me that he actually caught the ball as well, which was...
Oh, he did? Oh,
yes.
Good.
But, you know, his war poems, and I like the way there was a kind of practical genesis to this, you know, that, you know, to be doing a PhD and a book coming out of it as part of the PhD.
Yeah.
His mission, in a way, is to continue the project that somebody like Wilfred Owen had of, you know, disabusing people of the idea that this was somehow noble or a provoking flag-waving glee or whatever, that it was a jolly poor idea.
Yes, I was interested when he said about when it came to the centenary, there wasn't a lot of response to it, or at least nothing that he felt was anything new. No one had anything new to say about it. And I was thinking just the other day about wars. I suppose it's because we had Remembrance Sunday and in Lewis, so they have Bonfire Night and everyone puts their wreaths around the war memorial. There are these war memorials, aren't there, across the country, which really were put up after the First World War. And I was thinking there's nobody alive who remembers the First World War. And one wonders, but will it just become less and less relevant? Do people now not feel the relevance of thinking about what happened in World War One? Is it sort of fading from our memories and our consciousness? And is what he was doing by finding the resonances with what's going on now, is that a good reason to keep it alive, the memory of the First World War?
We were talking about how the conditions now, the sabre rattling that we find ourselves involved with, and that sort of sense of sleepwalking into a conflict.
Yeah.
That there is a kind of learning from history that should be done, but it isn't. So Martin was a delightful guest to have on anyway. I felt like I could have talked to him for a long time. In fact, we did talk for ages. And I did have to get it was really hard to edit him down. In fact, he's the sort of person when you talk to him, you think, what you really need is just to go to the pub and talk for 3 hours. Try and condense that into an interview is quite hard, really.
Perhaps we should have done the Martin Malone special, the unedited, the uncut Malone, and it would just be like the whole episode.
Martin Malone, unexpurgated. Yeah, so Martin mentioned Dylan Thomas at one point. I was thinking, Dylan Thomas, I've always really liked Dylan Thomas, but he's been incredibly unfashionable for decades now. And it sort of makes me wonder why, really, because there is something really supercharged and quite exciting about his writing. He died when he was 39.
Oh, really? I didn't realise he was that young.
And, he was a famous boozer and all that kind of stuff, but actually he had persistent lung problems that kept him out of the army, and not that he particularly wanted to go, but...
Yeah.
And actually, in the post-mortem showed he had sort of chronic pneumonia and various other conditions.
Oh, God.
So he was born on the 27th of October 1914 in Swansea. His dad was a highly literate person, and he named Dullan after a character in the Mabinogion, and his mother apparently was worried that his schoolboy friends would call him Dull One or something. So he actually insisted on an English pronunciation, Dylan.
Right. Interesting.
So I wonder if that sort of insecurity of being thought dull somehow fed into his kind of larger-than-life personality. He's one of these people I think of as having to live up to this idea of, what it is to be a great artist. I think that especially in rock music and so on, people that, almost deliberately push themselves to extremes in terms of substance abuse and, the lifestyle.
Yeah.
That somehow that makes them more authentic. He makes me think of this also of Friedrich Nietzsche, and why not,
That's a typical Kenny segue, I think.
Somewhere in the 1870s, Nietzsche wrote this book called The Birth of Tragedy, and he had this idea that you could split things into Apollonian and Dionysian principles. So Apollonian is like Apollo and the sun, and very clear and rational and organised and full of light, and Dionysian, passionate and chaotic and associated with the Greek god Dionysus and kind of lusty and in, drinking and emotion and ecstasy, a wilder, more exciting, perhaps less rational side. And I think Dylan Thomas, his use of language was that kind of glorious sort of swirl of a blood rush of, excitement in his language. And the movement that kind of came immediately after him, certainly in England, was called The Movement, and it had Kingsley Amis and Larkin and Donald Davy and Elizabeth Jennings, Tom Gunn and so on. And they were much more on the other side, on the Apollonian side, of being quite clear, and the fact that they had gone so far in the opposite direction meant they were very scornful about Dylan Thomas, and his reception sort of soured, and people started, there are letters between Kingsley Amis and Philip Larkin that are absolutely withering about him and his personality and so on.
Great.
He had 90 poems published in his life, and half were written between 1930 and 34, while he was still a teenager, basically.
So he was a bit of a prodigy. Does that indicate that perhaps he wrote less as he got older because of his illness, or?
Life took over a bit. He was struggling to make a living as a poet, and we all know how dismal and difficult that can be.
Yeah.
And he had a very fiery marriage with 3 children, and was starting to do reading tours. His readings were very electrifying, and there are recordings of those. They seem quite mannered to us now. Yes, the language is kind of chosen for its sound.
Yeah.
Often kind of gets carried away in meanings that are a bit nebulous. There's a real excitement about his word choice, and everything has so much energy. My feeling is I'd much rather read Dylan Thomas than a lot of the movement poets, for example. We'll just quickly dip in and read one of his short poems, which is about poetry. In my craft or sullen art.
Ah, yes.
In my craft or sullen art, exercised in the still night, when only the moon rages, and the lovers lie abed, with all their griefs in their arms, I labour by singing light, not for ambition or bread, or the strut and trade of charms on the ivory stages, but for the common wages of their most secret heart. Not for the proud man apart from the raging moon I write on these spindrift pages, nor for the towering dead with their nightingales and psalms, but for the lovers, their arms round the griefs of the ages, who pay no praise or wages, nor heed my craft or art. Romanticising the whole business of being, this lonely poet writing for lovers and people of passion, like this Dionysian sense of.
And also the lovers that he's doing it for, it turns out actually they pay no praise nor heed to his craft or art. So it really is a labour of love with no comeback.
As a young poet, I read that and thought, yes,
Yeah.
That's what you do. You're writing. You're under the full moon somewhere. While people are sporting in bed all around you in the houses, and you're writing poems for them that they won't even read. So let's turn a page on Dylan Thomas under the full moon.
I spotted a mention on Matt Rich's blog.
Oh yes.
The other day about someone who'd written yet another critique of the idea of poetry pamphlets. What are they for, basically? What's the point? It's called "What's the Point of Pamphlets?" is the title of this piece, which is written on a Substack by someone called Victoria, but I didn't catch her surname, and I looked again, and it's annoying. You say, here it is. Oh, it's by Victoria. Like, Victoria who? Can't find her name anywhere. Anyway. Victoria, who I gather is a poet herself, and she's based in France. She's sort of an Anglo-French poet, I think. That's what I've gleaned. Has recently wrote this long piece to say, basically, I'm a keen reader of poetry. Basically, I don't see the point of poetry pamphlets. What do they do? She acknowledges the kind of received wisdom that a pamphlet or a chapbook is always thought of as a first stepping stone for a poet towards the full collection. But she likens it a bit to academics who are expected to publish articles in the academic journals to kind of when they're new at the job to prove their publishing chops, and before they get a contract for a monograph, i.e. a book on a subject. And she sort of says, it's a bit artificial because nobody reads these academic articles necessarily. It might get cited by somebody, but it's just a rite of passage, something you have to do. And so she likens it to that. But then she sort of says, but actually it's not quite the same, because writing an article and then writing a book are two different styles of writing and two different things altogether. Whereas a pamphlet isn't dissimilar to a full collection. It's just a shorter version. Yeah. So that was one of her points. And then she sort of said, well, They're not available in shops, so you can't browse pamphlets. You're never going to come across a pamphlet unless you know the poet or someone points you to it. And those are her main points, I think. But she does, and she goes on to say that she would be interested in pamphlets that were perhaps anthology pamphlets, like a pamphlet with a taster of different poets, which you know a thing about, don't you, Peter? Because you've just been in one of these anthology pamphlets. And a sampler, exactly, where you get a sample of someone's work and then you think, oh, I'll look for their book, if they've got one, of course, but if they haven't, how do you find the pamphlet? Anyway, and then she talks a bit about in the past, obviously poetry was written in pamphlet form or broadsheet, etc. But these days, if you're writing on a single topic, then, you're probably going to put it online. But she also says she would quite like the idea of a pamphlet on a single topic, that's kind of, or a long poem that's not long enough for a whole book but long enough for a pamphlet. So I thought she made some interesting points, and I'm always interested to read these because you and I we've both published pamphlets and we like the form, but it's all good points, isn't it? They're not available in bookshops because they've got no spine, so
they're invertebrates, yeah.
They're spineless, completely spineless. But she does also mention towards the end that the only poet she could think of that publishes well in the pamphlet form and who is made their name as a poet is established was J.H. Prynne.
Oh, yeah.
I've not read his recent Blood Axe Poems 2016 to 2024 is 752 pages long.
Yeah.
So perhaps he had a wealth of material and thought, let's do a load of pamphlets. A couple of years ago, there was a small press publisher who published 12 Salima Hill pamphlets, one every month for the year.
Wow, yeah.
And she's someone who pushes them out. So, I don't know, perhaps it means that there's life in pamphlets if you're already established as a poet. But then again, you've still got this issue of where you buy them. I don't know. What do you think? Do you think? Is there any point in pamphlets?
I don't think you and I would have spent time publishing pamphlets if we didn't think that was the case. Like the J.H. Prynne, I've got a couple of his pamphlets.
Have you? Yeah.
Or very, very slim collections. And there is something quite elegant, especially because of the density of his work. The way he went about publishing was almost like, I know this isn't going to be for everyone, so I'm just going to publish it for my acolytes. And they were printed in print runs of 100 or 200 or something. I
like that idea. The main premise of this article, I think, was how do you get readers? Readers are the thing that you should be thinking about. There's other reasons for publishing pamphlets, for like you say, for your friends or your acolytes, or to sell at readings, or because you've got an idea and that's the best length. I didn't feel that in France there was this same absolute distinction between a pamphlet and a collection. Certainly here and in the US, I think, a pamphlet or a chapbook is up to maybe 30 pages. But after that, it's a collection. And I think that's a good point. And you just referenced the slim collections. And there used to be these slim editions, didn't they? I mean, that first one of Ted Hughes, The Hawk and the Rain, it's slim.
Yeah. Larkin's first collection was 20 poems, I think.
Was it? Yeah. So put a spine on it, call it a collection. Why is there this sort of line between the two?
Yeah. Quite often I have the sensation of reading a collection and thinking that would have made a good pamphlet because there's quite a bit of filler in here.
Interesting. Yeah, interesting.
Poetry, having ambitions in poetry is always a dangerous mindset, really.
Yeah.
Unless you're very lucky, you're not, unless you're a Dylan Thomas or something that has the knack of being in the right place at the right time to gain lots of attention. There is that kind of mindset of actually reveling in the fact that it's not for everyone to. It's it's like a limited edition. It's a very select thing that only a few people will have.
I love limited edition, and people would love it. You take something to a reading and you say, there's only 50 copies of these, and they're all handmade or something, and and people love that. They don't care what the poems are like. It's an artefact, isn't it?
And they're so portable as well. Right.
So, pamphlets, 10, collections, 8.
Also, so much of the stuff in pamphlets will then end up in, if you're lucky, in some kind of collection at the end, towards the end of your life.
Possibly. We should be more like Salima Hill and just pump out the pamphlets.
Damn the torpedoes.
So I thought I might just read a poem by Salima Hill.
Great idea.
This one was first published in 1997. It's called Please Can I Have a Man?
Okay.
Please can I have a man who wears corduroy? Please can I have a man who knows the names of 100 different roses? Who doesn't mind my absent-minded rabbits wandering in and out as if they own the place? Who makes me creamy curries from fresh lemongrass? Who walks like Belmondo in A Bout de Souffle? Who sticks all my carefully selected postcards, sent from exotic cities he doesn't expect to come with me to, but would if I asked, which I will do, with nobody else's, up on his bedroom wall, starting with Ivy, the famous diving pig, whose picture, in action, I bought 10 copies of, who talks like Belmondo too, with lips as smooth and tightly packed as chocolate-coated, melting chocolate, peony buds, who knows that piling himself stubbornly on top of me like a duvet stuffed with library books and shopping bags is all too easy. Please can I have a man who is not prepared to do that, who is not prepared to say I'm pretty either, who, when I come trotting in from the bathroom like a squealing, freshly scrubbed piglet that likes nothing better than a binge of being affectionate and undisciplined and uncomplicated, opens his arms like a trough for me to dive into. Perfect.
That's amazing, yeah.
She's excellent. I love her stuff.